to share it with everybody. And I want to start off by saying we're going to go through some slides pretty quickly, and I don't want people to feel like they've lost everything and have to scramble. If you would like resources, I'm happy to email that list to you at the end. So if you see a website or something on here that's interesting to you, there'll be an opportunity to get hold of it again. Okay, so have I got everything that we need? All right, hope I don't embarrass anybody. Here we go. Here we go. There we go. Okay, this is me. This is me a while ago. This is a younger me in extremely clean, brand new bee suit, collecting my very first swarm. And you can see I'm super proud of probably the smallest swarm that has ever been caught in the history of beekeeping. But I was pretty tickled. In late 2008, out of the blue, I kind of received the call. I had no background in beekeeping whatsoever, didn't know any beekeepers. It had never occurred to me to be a beekeeper, and suddenly it was all I could think about. And I started reading like a crazy person because I think it was fall or winter, and there's not much to be done then. And so I got my first bees in the spring of 2009. I still had never been inside of a beehive, which is a pretty bold thing to do, to order an animal that, you know, oh my gosh, they're a little bit intimidating, potentially. So that was kind of my start. Right away, I realized that I was going to need some support. I joined the Lane County Beekeepers Association. I cannot say enough about how wonderful those folks are, very generous with their time and expertise. They have excellent meetings. If you want to learn about honeybees, they're the go-to folks. Also, as soon as they developed the program, I signed up for the Master Beekeeper program. And here I want to say that the Master Beekeeper program is a little bit different than the Master Gardener program that some of you may be familiar with. It actually has 3 levels, and it's designed to take a number of years to get through. The first level is the apprentice level, and our program's unique because it pairs you with a hands-on mentor, and then it has an educational component really similar to Master Gardener. The next level is the journey level, and that is a little more involved. It involves public service, a lot more extensive training, and that is the level of the Master Beekeeper program that I've actually completed. I'm still noodling around in the highest level, the mastery level, which is more extensive yet. So I also invested heavily in equipment. Beekeeping is not a cheap hobby. I spent a lot of time, and I pretty much said yes to everything. As soon as you buy a bee suit and start talking about beekeeping as much as I did, people come to you and they say, "Hey, I've got this swarm of bees stuck in my wall," or "I've got this swarm of bees in my shed." And of course, unfortunately, they're not talking about a swarm, they're talking about an established colony. And so what I ended up getting myself into early on was doing removals. The slide on the left is on the campus of one of the Elmira schools. There was a particularly nasty colony of bees living in their wall, and they needed them out. That was an interesting project. This other thing on the right is actually a wood duck nesting box, which when I got this call, I said, okay, that's interesting. A duck nesting box, thinking it was on the ground. This box was actually 15 feet up in the air on a tree that overhung a lake. So, and this is in my yard, so I did get it down and didn't die in the process, so that was good. I also said yes to a lot of swarm calls. This is just something that honeybees do every spring, and boy, it's a lot of fun. That's not me up on the lift there. That is one of my really inventive neighbors. And I went to help him with a swarm that was really high up in a tree. Swarms are a good time, and there's nothing better at the end of the day than watching them all walk in. Super entertaining. I decided when I started that I would learn faster if I had more bees. When you make a lot of mistakes, you learn quickly. And so I made an investment in multiple styles of hive bodies. Oh gosh, the ones on the left are the standard Langstroth boxes that migratory beekeepers use. They're the ones that we're most familiar with seeing. And then I also tried some Kenyan top bars and some long hives. I wanted to learn a lot, and I made a lot of mistakes, but it ultimately ended in some success. If you have ever been in a bee colony, you know that these are awesome frames, and you can see me holding them up like they're my proud babies and taking pictures. It was ridiculous, but there they are. The frame on the upper right is a brood frame. That's a beautiful, beautiful frame of pupating baby bees. The frame on the bottom is a honey frame, and that is going to be glorious in a jar at some point. The upper left frame is a frame in spring, and all of those big peanutty looking things are large, glorious queen cells. And the queens are pretty valuable, so I was really happy. I was so happy that I talked to everybody I knew about honeybees, whether they wanted to hear it or not, I'm afraid, and I apologize to everybody I tortured. I was learning so much and it was interesting. So I just talked and talked and talked. I happened to work at a school, and for whatever reason, my second grade teacher thought it was a great idea to have the kids learn about bees. And so we got to do some pretty phenomenal things because I kept hives at home. The upper left is a little girl holding a drone bee, a live drone bee. We got to help install nucleus colonies at Oak Ridge School. Those are those center frames. We learned all about the life cycle of honeybees. Got to bring bees into the classroom in observation hives. And at one point, we actually got to have our own hive on campus. And that is one of our brave educational assistants in a bee suit, being an incredibly good sport and helping us out as we inspected that hive. I also did some master beekeeping instructor classes. They let me teach, go figure. And I was also a mentor in that program, because after I became a journeyman, then there was a whole class of apprentices that needed a mentor. And so I volunteered to do that. And that was a tremendous learning opportunity. I also got to volunteer at pollinator events, the Glory Bee Day, great spot, and fairs, and it was a marvelous time. So all of this lovely learning led me to rethink gardening. Suddenly I was really focused on what nectar and pollen plants were available for my new pets. And so I noticed that I started purchasing plants that had those rewards. And it was really informative to watch how much of what I planted actually got utilized. And I was surprised about a lot of things. Pictured here are lavender on the left and borage on the right. Those are sort of garden standards. The plant in the middle is a plant called Silphium perfoliatum, which I chased down after reading a study out of Poland that said that this plant cranked out tons and tons of nectar. We use it for honey production in Europe. So while I'm having all this wonderful fun, I'm also learning that there are some serious challenges to honeybees. Many of you may have seen this image. This got put in the media quite a bit. We really rely on bees to produce a lot of our most delicious foods. Things like wheat don't require a pollinator, but many of our fruits and vegetables, whether they're a fruit that actually needs to develop properly through pollination, or a crop that relies on a good seed set to create more seeds, like broccoli, for instance. You wouldn't think about that as necessarily needing great pollination, but you can only get broccoli seeds if you have good seed set, and pollinators are the go-to critters for that. There was a lot of media attention on this. We got some fabulous statements. My favorite one is the one that was attributed to Einstein. And we don't think now that he actually said this, but it went around. If the bee disappears from the surface of the earth, man would have no more than 4 years left to live. Again, probably not Einstein, but the feeling was there. The bees are in trouble and our food is at stake. There was lots of media attention and everybody got on board. This is a Greenpeace ad. There's our beautiful honeybee, and everybody wanted to save the bee. This is an interesting one because these folks are selling jewelry and saving the bees. There's our honeybee again. This is my favorite one and my most recent media find. This is an advertisement for tobacco products that somehow has jumped on board the Save the Bee campaign. I did get curious. Tobacco plants are pollinated by moths, so go figure. Anyhow, certainly everybody is excited about the plight of pollinators. And those threats are many. As a beekeeper, attending conferences, classes, the first thing you learn about is parasites. And the most recent bad bug in honeybee hives is the varroa mite. So much so that we would joke that we weren't going to beekeeping conferences, we were going to varroa mite conferences because so much of the information had to do with varroa mites. And one of the serious problems with varroa mites in a honeybee colony is that they vector in a lot of diseases. This is a short list. Deformed wing virus, acute bee paralysis virus, slow bee paralysis virus, black queen cell virus. It goes on and on. They are bad. They're a little bit like the needle user in the bar. They puncture the bee and vector in a lot of harmful pathogens. Another problem was pesticides and chemicals. And I have to say, a lot of these are beekeeper introduced. If you do a wax analysis inside of a beehive, a lot of the chemical that you find is miticide. So that's problematic. Some other environmental chemicals that you'll find are from agriculture or even home gardening. There are residues that can end up in the honey and the wax. So they're clearly being affected by those chemicals. Another problem, huge problem, is forage. Pollinators need nectar and honey, and that comes from flowers. And flowers grow in landscapes that are rich and diverse. And we are not doing that very well right now. The way we develop our land kind of makes it very simple and very sterile, and that causes huge problems. One of the more recent problems is changes in weather patterns, and that's not depicted on this cartoon because climate change has become more better understood in how it affects pollinator relationships with their environment. So yeah, all pretty discouraging stuff. More discouraging is that some very intelligent folks were really starting to question whether or not everybody getting excited about keeping bees was actually helpful. This is an article from HoneyBeeSuite written by a woman named Rusty Burley, who I really respect. She's an entomologist and beekeeper and is just incredibly knowledgeable. And she's questioning whether or not we're doing the bees a good turn by keeping more of them. Really, the problem is that there's not enough to eat. So introducing more bees into our environments is not helpful. Even ideas that like beekeeping could be bad for bees. This article went around several years ago, but still the thought is there. So some honeybee facts. When I talk to people, they are surprised that honeybees are not actually native to North America. This continent's ecology did not evolve with European honeybees. They are from Europe. So they were introduced when the settlers first came in the 1600s, along with their food culture. And they were primarily brought here for the products of the hive, honey and beeswax. Those were highly valued commodities. In recent times, honeybee colonies have become important to large-scale agriculture. As the landscape changed, those managed pollinator colonies became more and more important because the way farms work was shifting. And in truth, as I found, the European honeybee is not going extinct. It is not on anybody's endangered list. So that made me kind of think hard about what I was doing. One of the interesting things I noticed as I was going through my learning was that most of the research that's done on pollinators is done on honeybees. There's relatively little to be found research-wise about the effect of all of these problems on any pollinators outside of managed honeybees. So that's where a lot of the money is and the research. So back to our problems. This gentleman is Dr. Ramesh Sagili, and I have been privileged to listen to many of his talks. He is a specialist at OSU on honeybee health, and he acts as a liaison between beekeeping and agriculture. So he works between those two groups of folks to try to figure out ways of keeping both crops and bees healthy and in balance. And one of the talks he was at, he was asked what is the biggest problem with keeping honeybees healthy, and he pointed to insufficient forage. And that surprised me because all of these other problems were pretty dreadful. But he said that if bees have appropriate nutrition and adequate forage, they can overcome a lot of difficulty. And that really got me thinking. If we look at our environment, we're not really supporting our pollinators with what we're doing. So taking a look around at some really common landscapes, our agricultural landscapes tend to be pretty scrubbed. This is an almond orchard, and in almond orchards, nothing else is allowed to bloom, and they can be many, many, many acres big. So when bees are brought into an environment like this, not only are they struggling with the many pesticides used for almond production, but there's also it's a monocrop. There's not anything else to eat except almond nectar and pollen, which is the way the almond growers need it in order to get a good fruit set, but not so good for bees. This is the bottom picture. That's your standard urban environment. We have a lot of buildings, we have a lot of pavement. And the way we keep our homes can sometimes be a little bit like a monocrop. We like our grass perfectly green and without any weeds, with shrubbery and trees to a minimum. This is not good pollinator habitat. When you add to that habitat that has been scraped and scrubbed a lot of animals, you're going to have some problems. Looking at the picture of the cows, of course, there's a problem there. Everybody can see that. There are too many cows and not much to eat. But when we think about how we keep bees, the situation is not too different. In wonderful, undisturbed environments, this kind of setup can work, but more and more we're causing habitat fragmentation, degradation, and just generally it's not a good world out there for them. So there was an interesting study done by a man named Thomas Seeley, Forest, New York, and he studied feral honeybee colonies. And what he found was that the natural stocking rate of the bees that were living in that forest were about a quarter mile apart. And you can see these hives are not a quarter mile apart. So how much forage is enough? This is a really tricky thing to figure out. There's not a lot of great information. One gentleman, Kim Flottam, long time beekeeper and educator, came up with a recipe. And basically what he estimated is that to support one honeybee colony, you need continuous bloom from 1 month before the last frost to 1 month after the last frost, first frost, pardon me, just to keep one colony alive, 1.25 acres. Okay, and I scratched my head. I said, how much is 1.25 acres? It's about a city block. It's about a football field. And if you look at the city block, how much of that is blooming? So to get a honeybee colony through a winter, you need about 200 pounds of honey. That's a lot of honey and 40 pounds of nectar. So this environment is not going to produce that. And in spite of the fact that they can fly 3 to 5 miles, if everybody on the block has a honeybee colony, those resources are going to be stretched pretty thin. Okay, let's take a breather. Oh my goodness. I hope I haven't overloaded you with too much information. Let's get some questions if there are any, and let me know if there aren't, and we'll move on.
Just first, I wanted to let you know that we're having some issues with your audio. So
my
maybe,
audio?
Yes.
Oh,
I don't know.
dear.
It's just going fast and slow sometimes. I don't know if you're getting a message on your computer about your connection.
Nothing.
Okay. Okay.
Okay. Wow. Good
Kelly,
thing you didn't play the cartoons too.
We can understand you, but sometimes it's getting a little softer. Your voice is getting a little faster sometimes.
Kelly, what might help is if you turned off your video. So
oh, I'd be so happy to do that.
I thought that might actually be a suggestion you'd be right on board with.
Oh yes, I'm so tired of looking at myself on Zoom. Stop video, beautiful. Okay. Now you
okay, we do have some questions here.
Okay.
The first one is, could you repeat the name of the yellow flower between the lavender and the borage?
Yes, that's Silphium perfoliatum, and I'd be happy. Can I put that in the chat?
Yeah.
Cool. See how my spelling is at this time.
Yeah, I was going to say that's not an easy one to spell.
Okay,
Ah, there we go.
there you go. I think it's called cup plant, which is really vague, but there's a number of species. So that one grows about 10 feet tall.
Okay.
Yeah.
Another question is, does keeping hives impact the native bee populations?
Ooh, I like the way you're thinking. Hold on to that one. Anything else?
Reminder that people should put in questions. I have one. You mentioned that honeybees are not native to North America. Do you know which bees are native?
I do. Excellent. Okay, that is where we're heading, folks. Good job.
Okay.
All right. Very nice. Okay. Shall we go?
Here's another one here.
Another one.
What plants maximize pollen production for a limited space?
Yes, hang on. You guys are so sharp. Okay, I'm glad I didn't confuse anybody. Let's go forward and we'll see if we can answer some of these questions. Are you ready?
I think we're ready.
Okay, here we go. All right, so forward. Oh, sorry, folks. There we go. Okay, back to the Silphium perfoliatum. This photograph is taken standing underneath the Silphium perfoliatum because, like I said, that plant is 10 feet tall. And this photograph represents sort of a moment of epiphany because I went out to my garden to see how my honeybees were foraging, and I looked up, and what I saw was honeybees, but I also saw a lot of other bees, things that were large, things that were small, things that flew quickly, things that flew slowly. I didn't recognize hardly any of them. And that got me incredibly curious. Knowing everything that I knew about the troubles that my honeybees were having, I wondered what on earth is happening to all these other creatures. So I started off with my honeybee, and then I started reading and researching, and this is what happened to my head. Oh my gosh, there are so many bees. I was overwhelmed and fascinated. So we're going to look at a few of these bees, but first we need to clear up some terminology. We're really familiar with honeybees and their lifestyle. They live in large congregations called colonies, and they are casted. That means that they have differentiated genders. They have two types of female. They have a queen and a worker. Workers work. The queen's only responsibility is to lay eggs. The drone's only responsibility, as I drill into my second graders, is to mate with the queen. Social insects do reproduction on two different levels. They do it on the individual level where the queen and the drone is mating and then she lays eggs, but they also reproduce on a colony level, which means that at a certain point in the season, if things are going well, there a whole section of the colony splits off to make a new colony. The other type of social bees that we're familiar with is the bumblebee, and they live in much smaller colonies, and they have a different overwintering strategy where honeybees stay basically active all year. They may stay home, but they're still awake and moving and consuming food. Honeybee or bumblebees, the entire colony dies off except for the newly mated queens. So those are examples of social insects. Solitary insects do things a little bit differently. They only have they don't have caste. They have a male and a female bee, and every female bee is a queen bee. She is responsible for laying eggs. She's also a worker. She's responsible for provisioning all of her young. And they have an ephemeral life cycle. They are active for part of the year and then spend the rest of the year pupating or in the larval stage, And that's a more prevalent life cycle as far as pollinators go. There are there's a range of foraging strategies. Some bees are specialists. They only go to one type of flower. Some to the point where they're obligate pollinators. There's only one bee pollinating one flower, and that, of course, is a pretty delicate relationship to maintain when habitats are so impacted with development and fragmentation. Other bees are generalists, like this Megachile on the right. She goes to lots of different flowers, doesn't have any problem navigating different flower structures, and honeybees are that kind of pollinator. There are between 400 and 800 species of native bees just in Oregon, and that's a huge range because we don't actually know what's here yet. They haven't all been cataloged. They pollinate everything, everything in the forest, everything in the meadows. All of the plants that are indigenous to this area never relied on European honeybees. They're critical to ecology. They're also at a greater risk because of their solitary lifestyles, small ranges, and the fact that a lot of them are specialists. And this is always a surprise to people. 70% of them make their nests in the ground. There's some strong differences between honeybees and native bees. Both are vital to agricultural systems, but honeybee colonies are mostly used in large monocrop systems, while other managed bees like bumblebees are used to pollinate crops that honeybees don't pollinate well, mostly because they are buzz pollinators. Honeybees are protected by environmental issues because their queen never leaves the hive other than swarming. So she's somewhat protected. If you think of like a chemical spray, she's not going to get it straight, whereas a solitary bee is out foraging and she will be impacted by any environmental chemicals she comes across. It's better to be a generalist in a lot of situations because you are able to choose from more different types of plants. Flight ranges are different. Honeybees can go a long way to find food, and native bees are much more limited, mostly based on their body length. So a smaller bee has typically a smaller range. We already talked about how much forage a honeybee colony requires, and because the research is not there for native bees, we don't really know how much they need. Perennial, those honeybees are active year-round, consuming resources, and native bees just use them for a little while, and then they kind of go dormant. It's a pretty handy strategy. I want to note here the forage ranges because we're going to take a look at a few bees, and I just want you to pay attention because remember how big an area our honeybee colony needs in full bloom for months, and keep that in mind as we look at these next slides. Real quick, here's our honeybee. She is a social animal. With casted queens, workers, and males, and they nest in cavities. About 40 liters is their favorite size. Flight range 3 to 5 miles. Okay, there's our reference point. Let's compare those to our familiar bumblebees. Most people know about bumblebees. They are also casted and social. They can live in cavities or underground tunnels, a lot of times left over from moles or mice. They can fly about 1.5 miles for food. Leafcutter bees are ones that we're maybe less familiar with. They are solitary. They nest in cracks and crevices, existing spaces. The bee folks call these kinds of bees renters because they move into places that already exist. Their flight range is only 500 yards. Mining bees also nest in the ground. They're solitary and their flight range is 300 yards. Sweat bees, we see a lot of these, and in fact, these are the same family of bees that the alfalfa growers use to pollinate their alfalfa crop. They nest in aggregations in the ground, and their flight range is only 200 yards. Carpenter bees, these things are so tiny. They're maybe a quarter of an inch long, very small. You might mistake them for a fly. They love to nest in little pithy stems like blackberry, and only fly 200 yards. Orchard mason bees, folks might be familiar with these. They've become very popular for backyard gardeners. We've all seen those lovely little blocks they sell in the stores. Their range is only about the size of that football field, so that everything they need needs to be inside of a football field. And this is my favorite one. Their flight range is a mere 160 feet. Their entire lives are spent within a space that small. So if everybody's, how are we doing? Is everybody hanging with me? Y'all awake? Wake up. Is everybody awake? Sun's going down. We've been sitting too long.
There is one question here about where you get the seeds or plants for this Silphilium that you mentioned.
I bought them so long ago and they're so successful at self-sowing. I'm going to have to look up where I purchased them, but I would happy to include that information in the resource list.
Got it.
And there's another person that mentioned that she has a husband that's allergic to bees that sting, so she's talked him into mason bees.
Excellent, wonderful, wonderful idea. I have the kids stand in front of our mason bee house and just watch them go in and out, and the mason bees just fly right around them. They're lovely bees. Good point.
Question. I've heard of African honeybees, and I know that the honeybees you've been talking about are from Europe. Are there any native bees that make honey?
That's a great question. Not in North America. There are South American bees that make honey, and bees in Australia, mostly tropical places. They have much smaller colonies and make much less honey, so that honey is very dear to the folks who harvest it. I'm not an expert. I'm sorry, I can't throw around any names, but yeah, it's mostly a tropical thing.
There is a question here about getting some books, good books about bees.
Oh, you guys are always a step ahead of me. Let's go. All right. I'm going to answer these questions. All right, let's see if I can forward my slide in a timely fashion. There we go. Okay, so all of your fabulous questions, maybe most of your fabulous questions, might be answered by watching this amazing webinar. We are really fortunate to have Dr. Gail Langolato not only in charge of the Master Gardeners, but she does incredible research. If you track her garden ecology lab, she posts her results, and this was a wonderful webinar, super encouraging. The statistics are here. 2% of land area that we as gardeners have control of does not seem like a lot, but it's a lot in the places that we live. And if you think back to the ranges of some of those native bees, your yard, your block, your neighborhood park could be an entire habitat for a native bee. So this webinar was really encouraging to me. It was done in Portland, like very urban Portland. And basically what they did is they chose, people volunteered their yards for research, and Dr. Langolato and her crew went in regularly and sampled the bees that were in their yards, and they were able to sample enough yards and enough bees over a long enough period of time that they were able to draw some conclusions around what to plant and cultural practices that were either good for bees or not so good for bees. So if you have time, I would highly, highly recommend watching that. And her webinar kind of sums up what we're about to go through in the next few slides. One of the most important things, of course, was to plant bee-friendly plants. This is really important because as gardeners, we tend to choose things that are gorgeous, sumptuous flowers with lots of petals. But we need to realize that every plant that needs pollination has its own strategy for doing so. And not all of them involve an animal pollinator. If you think about grasses, many trees, conifers, rely on the wind for pollination. They put no resources into making nectar because the wind doesn't care. What we want to do if we want to support bees is select flowers that offer those floral rewards, because pollination is a conversation and you have to have both sides of it in balance in order for it to happen. If we want to support bees, we need to select things that are rich in pollen and nectar. Dr. Langolato was sort of up in the air the last conference I went to, whether native or cultivated varieties were best. She was leaning towards natives, primarily because when we create cultivars, we take a lot of the features in a flower, the stamen or the stigma, and they're converted into more petals. If you compare the dahlia on the right with the rose on the left, those stamens are what are full of pollen for pollinators. It is really, really tough to find any pollen on that zinnia because all of the stamens have been converted through breeding into petals. So mostly singles are better in general, but what you're going to want to do, as I did with that Silphium perfoliatum photo, your greatest tools are your powers of observation. When you go into your garden or a city garden or a friend's garden, watch and listen. What you see and hear will tell you what is the best resource for bees. And when you see that, take note. Those are the plants you're going to want. Another takeaway from the webinar was to plant in blocks. And this is really common advice. If you are going to the supermarket, you want to buy everything in one place. You don't want to go from one store to the next store to the next store to fill your grocery list. And bees do the same thing. They need to forage efficiently. And when they go from flower to flower, they want it to be fast and efficient. So when you're planting in blocks like this cosmos here, they don't have to work as hard to get the job done. Oh gosh, there's just a whole huge mishmash. You'll notice the zinnias I planted that particular year are singles. They have a huge boss of stamens that goes on and on for weeks. They're pretty amazing. The other advice is to pay attention to what's blooming when. This is a chart from the Klamath Valley beekeepers, and it is really tailored for honeybees, but it gives you an idea of what the season is for bloom. Of course, there's lots and lots blooming in May and June. We know that as gardeners. What is helpful to bees is if we provide nectar and pollen sources early in the season and late in the season. So you can help out a lot by planting a full season of bloom. Also pay attention to your flower shapes. We're aiming for diversity. All the bees I showed you have different lengths of tongues. They have different ways of carrying pollen, and the more diverse your flowers are, the more diverse your bee visitors will be. Asters are super helpful to many species of bees. Colors you're aiming for bees are yellow, blue, and white, whereas say you wanted to attract hummingbirds, you would go for red. Sunflowers and Clarkia are wonderful for attracting a large, sunflowers for a large number of species of bees, and Clarkia is a great Willamette Valley native for specialists. These are just a few of the things that I have experimented with. Upper left is Gilia capitata, a lovely little pom-pom shaped flower, just alive with bees. The middle is Oregon grape, tall Oregon grape, lovely early in the season, especially for bumblebees. Douglas aster, phenomenal plant, blooms late in the season, as does the Solidago canadensis in the lower left. Great fall blooming flower. Middle bottom is our native thimbleberry, and that fabulous pink thing is Clarkia ammiona. Pardon my bad Latin. Here's a great example. I wish I had a better camera. Sunflowers attract so many different kinds of pollinators, and they bloom for a ferociously long time. That whole head in the center, those are all individual flowers. So they open from the outside in, and they provide weeks of forage for pollinators. On the right, lots of Douglas aster and borage, lots of varieties of bees foraging there. One thing that gardeners tend not to think about is trees. Trees are remarkable in that they pack so much forage into the same footprint. The tree on the left is a Sephora japonica that I stumbled across, I think late summer on Coburg Road. And the thing was just alive. It was alive with honeybees at that point in the season, but ferociously loud with humming. The middle picture is our native cascara. These trees in June sound like there's a swarm in them. There are so many different kinds of bees buzzing through them. And the right is a classic honeybee tree, the basswood or linden. Shrubs are also a terrific bet. Native Nootka rose, ocean spray, and ninebark. Somebody mentioned that they were growing ninebark. Snowberry is another fabulous native plant. There are also native ceanothus you can choose from. This center picture, the blue, is oh gosh, it's a cultivar, Victoria ceanothus, but that thing was my best bee plant last year. Just tremendously helpful. There are lots and lots of guides for finding trees and shrubs. I also want to mention, you don't have to plant everything, but sometimes it's helpful to recognize what is the useful plant. Maybe it's already growing in your garden environment. Something that is somewhat underappreciated, for instance, is willow. Willow is a terrific bee plant in the early spring. It provides pollen and nectar when nothing else is blooming, and the bees are really hungry. And planting guides abound. Lori Weidenhammer is, I heard her on Pollination Podcast, which is another great resource if you want to learn all things pollinator. She wrote a great book called Victory Gardens for Bees, which is kind of fun and accessible, but well researched. She's from British Columbia, so a lot of her ecosystems overlap with ours. But again, your powers of observation are your best helpers. Watch and listen to your garden landscapes. Okay, but it's not all about the plants. Plants are what we love, but there are some cultural things that we need to address. And part of that is public perception. We are really used to gardens looking a certain way, but pollinators need all of their requirements met in sometimes a very small area. They need adequate nesting sites. They need water, and when the weather is poor, they need shelter. What they love the best is for us to leave them alone. a few quiet, neglected places in your yard, if you can choose those carefully so as not to bother your neighbors. It requires a change of aesthetic, but that can be super helpful. Undisturbed places, next to walkways, maybe trash cans even. Keep your eyes out for those kind of things. And another thing that Dr. Langolato mentioned, this was at a conference, is to reevaluate what we're seeing in our gardens in terms of ecologic beauty. It's a little different than the aesthetic that we're used to. We need to be providing water. Bees like mason bees require mud to provision their nests. And if everything is mulched or dry, it's really hard for them to find it. This is a tough one. We've gotten very used to the idea of monocrop lawns, and what is really helpful to pollinators is encouraging those things that bloom underfoot. When we think about how much space our lawns take up, it's actually a lot of real estate. And if you can allow things to bloom in your lawn, there are even pollinator lawn mixes now with clover and prunella and dandelion in them. Again, this is a little bit tricky because our aesthetic has changed over time to really rely on those super hygienic looking yards, and that is not what's helpful to pollinators. This one was a tough one for me to wrap my head around. I grew up as a gardener mulching everything deeply, and as we learned, 70% of our native bees are ground nesting. That means that they need unobstructed dirt, preferably with a warm exposure, south exposure, and it needs to be a little bit quiet. Maybe not no traffic, but we can't be spading around in the dirt all the time. They dig these amazing nests deep down into the soil sometimes, and when we turn the earth over all the time, it disrupts that nesting area. Also, another thing that that webinar looked at was overhead watering. The yards with overhead watering had far fewer bee species, far less traffic. So that's something to consider as well. Oh, this is my happy place. This is my garden on the right, absolute complete mess. And the way I feel good about it is that some of those pithy stems, that's a very large overgrown last season kale plant that went to flower. Sometimes those cavity nesting bees will take up residence in those stems and provision their nests. You can see on the upper left, looks like a mason bee nest cavity. They provision that ball of pollen. They've laid an egg on it, and then they built a little wall of mud. And all of these little holes that we see in the lower left are filled with growing larvae. So a little bit of mess is good. Weeds are a wonderful source of pollen and nectar. This is, again, my messy garden. I've let the Chinese cabbage go because I just missed it, but it blooms, and you can even see a butterfly scooting through there. The heartsease, Polygonum urticaria, common weed. I found so many bees on it. It was a big surprise to me. Oh, another one. We are used to perfect vegetation. That's what we strive for. But a little insect damage can be okay. If you see your leaves and you look at them and you say, oh my gosh, I have a huge problem, it helps to know that this little leaf cutter bee is actually the culprit. Leaf cutter bees make those perfect little circles and carry them off to their crevice nests, and they line their brood cells with them. Some bees use petals. I know my Clarkia was full of these little round holes. there's so many different types and they all use a little bit different materials, but that's what's going on there. So if we can recognize that's what's going on and maybe not get the spray bottle out, definitely avoid neonicotinoids. The toxicity assessments that have been done on pollinators, like I said, have mostly been done on honeybees. Many of the tests are run by the chemical companies. We do well to be a little bit careful. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about neonicotinoids, but I want to put this in perspective because neonicotinoids, as evil as they seem right now, were developed because the chemicals that farmers had to use before were damaging vertebrate species. It was obvious. They were also harming farm workers, and that's why these chemicals were developed. I was lucky enough to hear a great talk by Dr. David James, who's a researcher and monarch butterfly specialist at one of Lynn County's bee events, and he shared some research with us. They did a study that basically fed monarch butterflies nectar that was laced with neonicotinoids at a very controlled rate. And at 3 weeks, which is not immediately, but at 3 weeks out, their mortality increased tremendously compared to the control group. Where we're seeing this use is in agriculture at 50 to 100 parts per billion. Garden use, this is surprising to me, garden use sees set 500 to 700 parts per billion, quite a jump. Landscape use, even a higher concentration. But this is the thing that shocked me. The greatest level of neonicotinoids were found in greenhouses and nurseries. Folks, this is where we get our plants. And just to put that into a visual, I had to increase the scale. The agricultural use hardly shows up as a blip. 21,000 parts per billion concentration in greenhouse environments. So that means we need to use pesticides really wisely. Lucky for us, OSU has some amazing resources. And in fact, there's an app that you can get for your phone. So when you're at Jerry's or Home Depot and you're in the pesticide aisle because you feel like you have a problem you need to address, you can call up this app on your phone and check it out, and they will tell you what the known impacts for pollinators are of that pesticide. Source your new plants carefully. This was a big wake up for me because I am totally guilty of buying any and every plant, particularly the ones that look sad and need saving. It is really important because those chemicals are retained in plant tissues for a really long time. Source your plants with care. There's great resources for finding out who avoids pesticides and systemic ones, especially in their nursery operations. And I was surprised to pick up these, they were on sale, plants that actually say neonicotinoid free. And that was a little bit encouraging that they are understanding that consumers are getting more savvy and demanding better plant products. Supporting your organic food producers is really important. We saw that the agricultural use of chemicals is not as tremendous as the ones in landscape and greenhouse use, but a lot of these organic farmers are pretty savvy and they're starting to incorporate set-asides and hedgerows that support pollinators in their farm ecosystems, and that is to be commended. Another way you can help is to, oh gosh, get crazy like me and talk a lot. Help people understand what they're seeing. I love this little news clip from the Sabin School. Their baseball field is the home of an aggregation of ground nesting bees, and they have educated themselves about it, and they have now made that bee their mascot. They are the tickle bees because the kids thought they were kind of tickly when they picked them up. Terrific stuff. And if you think your yard might be like not so handsome, maybe to your neighbors, put up some signage, explain what you're doing so that people understand and shift their aesthetic a little bit. Other ways you can get involved is through citizen science. We have some terrific programs. OSU is just out there doing great things. There are some national programs you can get on board with. For me, I have turned a little bit to the Master Melittologist program. I've basically gone from being a pretty good beekeeper to being a complete newbie when it comes to native bees. There's so much to learn, and I am just at the bottom floor. This is my pandemic collection. It does involve killing bees, which is a drag, but most of them can't be properly identified and cataloged without a microscope. So that is what I'm working on. Final thoughts. My story, and thank you for persevering through it with me. I became so invested in beekeeping, and it was painful for me. It is painful for me to pivot because I invested a lot. And I mention that because it sort of parallels what we've done as a society. We are very invested in our current ways of doing things, and it's going to cost us a little bit to change and do things in a way that work better for the other creatures in our environment. Never stop observing. Maybe think about shifting your perception of beauty. Reevaluate what you're doing, and don't hesitate to take action and experiment. And as I said, I have more resources. If you're interested, I'm happy to share. You can email me and ask me any question you want. I can go on about pollinators ad infinitum, and I'm always learning new things from curious folks like you. So thank you for sharing your evening with me. You are the beekeepers, the keepers of the bees. If we all work together, we can keep them on the planet with us for a long time. And that is the end of my presentation. Thank you for letting me go over time.
Okay, we have some more questions here for you. That was an excellent talk. Really learned quite a bit from that. One question was a clarification that are mason bees native to the Pacific Northwest?
They are. Osmia lignaria is one of our native bees. There are other mason bees, but that is the main one that we see, and it's certainly the one that's become popular because you can sell them readily. So you can actually buy tubes full of mason bees or mason bee cocoons. They are native though.
Okay.
Yeah.
Another question, how do specialist bees get all their proteins if they only forage from one specific plant?
So those plant pollinator relationships are very old, and the plant has it in its best interest to provide the appropriate nutrition for its pollinator and vice versa. It's just one of those nifty ecological niches that has developed over thousands and thousands of years. Pollen is the protein, nectar is the carbohydrate. There's also a lot of trace minerals and other nutrients involved, but that's the basic breakdown. So those specialist bees are getting everything they need from that plant.
Okay. Another question is that this particular person gardens without pesticides, but her neighbors do use them. Will this affect my plants where our yards meet?
Overspray is certainly a potential issue. It's well documented and hard to document at the same time. The problem is that the bees are not stopping at fences, and they will forage. It's unfortunate to me that homeowners are not required to take the same pesticide application courses as commercial applicators. It's really, really important that people follow the labels. Most pesticides say on the label not to use them on flowering plants. It doesn't really address the long-term systemic issues, but you know, a bee foraging on a dandelion that has been recently sprayed with an insecticide or a pesticide is going to have a problem. And there's not much to do about it other than to make your garden the very best it can. Interestingly enough, in the study that they did in Portland, the very smallest garden in their study was the most diverse in the number of bee species it supported. So don't lose hope and keep shifting your practice around until you're seeing more and more bees. I think it can happen.
Another question, does a bee species life cycle determine if it makes honey, or is it more complex than that?
So all bee species have strategies. Winter is a big problem for most animals. The way that honeybees have evolved to deal with that problem is they store up a lot of food so that they have it to use in the cold months when there are no flowers. These other bees, say the mason bee, for instance, it is only out as an adult foraging for maybe 6 to 8 weeks. And then it spends the rest of its life cycle inside that tube, either as an egg or a larva. By the time October comes, it's a fully developed adult, and it just waits out the winter in its brood cell until the weather turns and it emerges to mate and start the cycle over again. So I personally feel that native bees are so thrifty and economical with their use of resources. I can only imagine how many species of bee could be supported if the landscape was managed correctly, whereas to support a honeybee colony, a single species, you have to plant a lot of things that other bees can't use. So to me, my effort shifted a little bit when I realized that I could be doing more for these species that are a little bit unappreciated. Did that answer the question?
I think so.
Okay.
Another question about varroa beet mites.
Oh, varroa mites.
This person apparently lost 3 hives 2 years ago. He doesn't, I guess, from the mites, and just caught his first hive about 4 weeks ago, and those are doing great.
Okay. Yeah, we could go on for weeks talking about varroa mites and how they interact with honeybees. It is super common to lose colonies due to varroa mites and their associated pathogens, particularly if you're not managing the mites. And swarms are interesting because when the swarm leaves the colony, it leaves the bulk of the varroa mites in the parent colony. So for a while, they can do very well.
Okay, another question here. I would like to keep honeybees, however, I do not want to harvest honey. Is that possible?
That is possible. In fact, most people overharvest. As I mentioned earlier, it takes about 200 pounds of honey to sustain a colony throughout a year, and you shouldn't really harvest until you've met that 200-pound quota. It's a testament to how degraded our environment is that supplemental feeding is so common. Many people feed their honeybees sugar syrup because there's just not enough forage to make a good honey crop. or they're overstocked. There's just not enough food to go around. Yes, you can keep honeybees. It's still best, and there's a whole ethical argument to be made about beekeeping, particularly in populated areas. Your bees can become a problem for other people if they're not managed correctly. So that's a long conversation.
This is a question that was asked earlier. What plants maximize pollen production for a limited space? I think you answered that with the asters, the sunflowers, the Oregon grapes, goldenrod.
It also depends on which bee species you're trying to support, because like honeybees are pretty greedy. They need a lot. I mean, can you imagine collecting 40 pounds of pollen? That's a lot of pollen. Whereas the mason bee, for instance, it may provision 6 of those nest tubes in a season, and that's significantly less. And they're better pollinators if you have fruit trees and stuff. They're just more efficient.
And then this was a question asked earlier too. Does keeping hives impact the native bee populations?
That was my big existential concern as a beekeeper. I can't see how it wouldn't. I've noticed in my garden that the honeybees and bumblebees tend to forage on different plants than the native bee species, but real estate is at a premium. What you plant affects what lives there. And if all you're planting is, say because and that's supporting honeybees and bumblebees really well, you are not supporting native bees because of your plant selection. So I think the jury's technically still out, but I'm kind of worried as a beekeeper.
The only other point was that somebody's asking if you would put up the slide for your email again, because they definitely want to learn more. And then books, I think you mentioned you would provide a resource for books.
Oh my goodness, we could talk books all day.
Maybe put together a list.
If I had to choose one, and if you ever listen to the Pollination podcast, that's an excellent resource for books. I would say at least 30% of the people that Adoni Melittologist interviews recommend the Bees in Your Backyard. It's accessible, but thorough and absolutely fascinating. And that's by Messengill. I probably have a copy. I usually have a copy. Yeah, I can put that. I believe that is in my resource notes. So, yep.
Okay, those are all the questions.
You folks have incredible stamina. Thank you for putting up with me for such a long time.
Well, I want to chime in with thanks, not just for all the science and the information, but also your willingness to kind of share your soul searching, because there's a lot of that now when we're out in the garden and we're thinking about what we're growing for ourselves and managing, in my case, the yard for the dog, but also to be thinking about the wildlife. While you were talking, I watched a scrub jay family, an adult with some nestlings, go through the yard, and I'm thinking, oh, yay. Oh, don't beat up on my berries. It's hard. So your honesty and your willingness to share your evolution of your own thinking is just wonderful. Thank you so very much.
Thank you. I was hoping it would be useful because I feel like the everyman stumbling through my land management issues.
Well, and thank you for sharing that then, because you've come out with or come through it with a lot of interesting information. So
yeah, I'm sure things will continue to change as the research goes on. So stay tuned.
Well, so thank you for your time. We've got some thanks coming in on the chat. I'll also remind everyone that typically in July, the Lane County Master Gardener Association seminar is a plant